Well, hello everyone. I want to welcome you to this talk. It's a fairly impromptu talk. I did a little bit of planning beforehand. I've been wanting to talk about this for the last month or so. The topic is on Bauhaus and this kind of strange triangle, square, circle situation with these primary colors. And I've been wanting to do it for a while now, and I've definitely been unprepared, and I wanted to make something really extravagant, but I realized the more and more I prepare for it, the further and further off I'll push it, and probably never ever get around to making it. So, with that said, I just decided to bite the bullet and just go ahead and give a talk on kind of what I understand behind Bauhaus. And I've been reading this interesting book. I actually got it. It's called The ABCs of Triangle, Square, Circle by Lupton and Miller, and it's kind of a compilation of these essays. And I got it like maybe I think like 3 or 4 months ago or so, and I started dabbling in it, and I was just like, these guys just like way too kind of intellectual when it comes to discussing art, and kind of felt a little like postmoderny, and I put it down. But since I've been thinking about Bauhaus for the last like few years, and I actually saw a little exhibit of it at the Getty a couple of years back, I've been trying to wrap my mind around it. And basically, the best way I can describe it, just as a general concept or a general approach to it, is that it's a really intellectual approach to understanding something very, very rudimentary, something that is meant to be kind of approached from like a universal standpoint. So I'll be getting to that as best as possible. And the reality is, I don't have a firm grasp on the concept. And as many times as I try to read through the essays in this book, I still can't capture it entirely or summarize all these ideas into something digestible. And so I'm just going to, but there are I mean, there are some certain things that are starting to stand out for me. And this last week or two, I was out camping and I got to read through the book again and got some concepts that started to click a little bit better. And so I've organized some slides of some photographs I took while I was out in nature. I have some interesting visual notes as well, and so I'll do the best I can to kind of cover this topic. And I think it's kind of interesting for obviously for designers, but I think any artist might get some value out of it, just as food for thought. Because I noticed as I've been kind of getting more and more into this, um, it just kind of lingers in the background, and it definitely drives some of my compositional considerations, which I'll share some of a little bit later. And so just to set the scene, the last little impromptu talk I did was, just on my like disgruntled experiences with Discord, the garbage Discord interactions. And I was working on this bird, and I was retopologizing it. And since then, I spent a little bit more time on it, and I'm so close to finishing the retopology on it. I just have this beak to finish out, the bottom part of it. And then I also have this beak section right here to finish out. And then just kind of like tie these two parts together. It's taking a lot of time, and I know there's some really good tools out there. There's one called RetopoFlow, which I'll probably end up purchasing. It's like an add-on for Blender. It's like a little virtual space where I can just basically just draw like loops around whatever model is I'm working on, this bird or whatever. That would save me a lot of time. But I wanted to just, when getting back into retopology, just kind of get a feel for the basics again. And it's a bit of a grind, as I mentioned in the last video. But and with that said, the reality is I probably won't, since it's such an intellectual discussion and I don't really have like a firm grasp on the whole thing entirely, I probably actually won't get around to really doing a lot of like good retopology here. And since I have a lot of slides to share with you, that'll take a lot of my attention away. So with that said, I'll start to dive in, and I might just like kind of, you'll see me get not very far basically. So, so like, what is Bauhaus, or what are like the fundamental concepts of Bauhaus? And on the left side of the screen, I have these triangle, square, circle kind of situations. And these are kind of these ideas developed by this guy. I think his first name you pronounce Vasily Kandinsky, and he was an artist from the late 1800s to like the early first part of the 1900s, first half of the 1900s. And he was initially, it looked like he was a landscape painter. I'll share some paintings with you later on of his. And then he started to become, not become, he started to kind of develop this kind of universal, kind of rudimentary, fundamental understanding of like a vocabulary of visual language. And I think it was since it was developing at a time that was kind of around like the Industrial Revolution, and there's a lot more children going to school. There's a lot more like organization in school. This was an attempt to kind of bring to like really young children, especially like kindergarten age, this like really rudimentary approach to visual language. And some of it has to do with such as like contrast or light dark. You know, some of it has to do with color. And but the thing is, like, he was basically saying that if you just kind of consider these shapes right here first, like triangle, square, circle, these are supposed to be like kind of the most rudimentary shapes we can break anything out in nature down to. And that I think he believed, and this is not an accurate historical like approach to Bauhaus, and a lot of this is just kind of my speculation or just my understanding of it. So please, please don't take this as a historical like redo. But he believed that deep down inside, like primitively, we have these like understandings of these. I mean, we see these like they mean something to us, especially like psychologically. And then he also believed that there was some arbitrary correlation between these shapes and then the colors and the colors. So if you were just to take the shapes away and just like paint this section like all yellow, all red, all blue, we would also get like certain feelings from those experiences. Um, so the first thing that comes to mind, the reason why I posted this like kind of like triangle, square, circle like lines without the like planes filled in is because there was a guy. It was, I believe, it was in the 1800s, maybe early 1900s, named Ferdinand de Saussure. Part of my terrible pronunciation here, who basically started to look at and like understand that like language consisted of like kind of two separate like planes, if you want to like describe it that way, where the first plane is like based on sounds and then the second one is based on concepts. So um in language, a sound isn't necessarily correlated to a concept. So if I were to say the word hat, like if you didn't know English at all, like there would be no under, and you just heard the phonetic hat sound, like you would like never associate hat with the thing that you put on your head. But because there's some kind of developed like context behind that sound, then you start to understand that. And it crosses over too that when I say hat, there's also some context and uh, relationship with the other words of, for instance, crown or helmet. But then when I say the sound hat, there is a obvious correlation with the sounds hit and hut, for instance. But the bizarre thing is there's absolutely no conceptual correlation between hat and hit and hut. Those are all entirely different ideas. So Kandinsky kind of wanted to, it seemed like he was trying to make a correlation between, say, like a triangle and then bring in color and try to connect this concept in a kind of a similar way. So these shapes, they represent, this is the most extreme kind of aggressive shape. And then as you go towards the circle, from the triangle towards the circle, it becomes more passive. And then the square is supposed to represent something in between. And I could just wax on that for a little while and just say, like, yeah, like the triangle has the most angles, it's the sharpest, so it's the most aggressive. And we think about that, it kind of makes sense that it is the most like dynamic of the shapes. And then of course the square still has hard edges, but the hard edges are pretty kind of um, standard, or kind of like uh, patternistic, maybe you could say. And as a result, it kind of is a little bit less aggressive than the triangle. And then, of course, the circle is supposedly is what people say is the most passive shape, because it's just like the same thing going over, around and around and around. And I've heard that written in other design manuals and discussions. I've always wondered if that was just something that was like universally agreed upon in institutions, because I've always felt like the circle is one of the most like dynamic shapes, especially when I'm drawing, like curves or ellipses, which are just like variations on that concept. I feel like the that is one of the most like kind of interesting and dynamic shapes. But I think Kandinsky is would disagree with me on that concept. And then if we just take out the shapes and we talk about, for instance, the colors, Kandinsky argued that yellow was the most aggressive shape or dynamic, and then blue was the most passive, calm color. I say shape or color on the yellow. My apologies. So yellow is the most aggressive color, and then blue is the most passive color, and then red is in between. That's his kind of his thesis there. And then as a result of those, like he believed that you could use those as tools for teaching anybody, because he was under the assumption that every single human being like without a doubt, like psychologically deep down, primitively, like feels the same way. Of course, people today would disagree with that like wholeheartedly, but it's a good basis to start to develop some type of thoughts or food for thought or thesis or whatever you want to develop from there. Now I'm going to disagree with that immediately, because I always feel like red is the most intense. Yellow, yeah, yellow's like active, but I don't think it's intense. And then blue, of course, I would still put it in some of the more passive area. But if you think about it from like a value like perspective, I could probably bring the value on that up a little higher. Um, Something like this. So when I tab in, it looks like it desaturates it a little bit. So like right here, yellow, it's the brightest. Especially if I were to bring this down to like a grayscale, yellow's the brightest. Red's, occupies kind of the medium to brighter grayscale, and then blue, if you were to turn it to grayscale, would be pretty fairly dark. Um, so in that sense, yellow is absolutely the most active of the colors. Um, is it aggressive? I don't really feel that way at all. And then, and man, I'll come back around to. I'll talk about my thoughts on these actual shapes too. But I want to kind of keep waxing on this kind of theory, or this like thesis that's going on from the Bauhaus. So this other idea is that when you have when you have like a line, there's like three different shapes, or I guess motions in art. This is again like this is them attempting to reduce everything down to kind of a universal understanding of things. So if I were to do like this is, oh, it just disappeared. Something like this, then it's a line, right? There's no plane whatsoever except for like the little thickness that Blender gives it here. But for our discussions, it's just a line. And this line represents the artist's, or my, in this case, kind of active feelings or thoughts or flow. And it's all supposed to be like related to some type of psychology. And then if I were to kind of like encase that then that would become, and then were to fill it in, for instance. Actually, I should do this. This is the next step. So you have both a plane and then a line, and then together they're both kind of occupying the same kind of feeling. So neither are active or passive. But if I were to then fill it in, then this becomes the plane aspect of it becomes active. Just like you have over here, these are planes, and these are just like planes made with lines. Then that plane becomes more active, and then the line itself becomes passive. And these are just meant to develop some type of like um, kind of contrast. And I couldn't really figure it out entirely, but it sounded like the Bauhaus school was kind of the originator of this like term graphic. And Kandinsky and some others seem to be like really excited about this idea that if you're plotting like information on a graph, um, then that graph, when it has data, like might be going like up and down, is one of, and it's not, it has no perspective to it. It's like super flat. That graph itself is one of the most readable, like legible forms of information. Like it's super easy, especially if you just communicate, okay, this is time, you know, money over time, or, you know, volume over time, or whatever you want to say. That graph, if I were to have XY like this, and then that graph, like, you know, you could recognize that like right away and understand that. So they started to kind of understand this as like a visual form, and then they wanted to kind of translate it into some type of like flat shape, flat like um, representational like form of symbolism. I don't know if those are the best words to describe it, but so then basically with that said, he starts to create these, you know, these like kind of these shapes, and start to say like, okay, these are also like super easy to recognize and like understand like pretty quickly. And so there's certain like, I think there is a certain like value to what he's saying for sure, but I immediately like start to wonder, like when I pull this out and I look at, like, I think about the shape yellow, or I'm sorry, the color yellow. The first thing I think about is just like the sun, and like, against like a blue sky, right? Like the sun itself is like, seems to be one of the most like active kind of objects in nature, and the sun is circular. So here you have like a kind of a contradiction between the color yellow and the shape of a circle. Um, Red we really only see in flowers and like sunsets, and so maybe because it's kind of like an evening, you know, between the active day and like the active, I mean, you know, and the nighttime, which is maybe darker. Um, then you have some type of like balance between those two. Um, so it starts to get a little confusing, and especially when you just start to consider like your own relationship with these like shapes and colors. Um, so, but it is sort of, it is food for thought, because at least when you start to consider this general concept of just really rudimentary shapes and rudimentary colors, like what kind of like psychological or like experiential ideas come to mind. Um, and I would say it's actually a really good tool, and it can lead to a lot of like really interesting things. So I went ahead and here we go. I went ahead and actually like this last week when I was out camping and I was reading this book, I was kind of thinking of that. I was thinking like, okay, well, like if I don't agree with Kandinsky's approach to shape and color, with especially like yellow and the sun, like what are some things in nature that are true that either do like connect with this concept, or, you know, disagree with that concept. So the first thing is like, you know, the sun, like this is kind of what I imagine the sun, maybe just paint this with like a blue background, but it'd be like yellow right here. And that'd just be like the clearest example of something in nature that every single human being has experienced, you know, timelessly. So that's like one easy disagreement I would have with his thing. And then of course the moon too is like a nice circle. These are like primary, like primitive shapes in nature that we experience, like every single human being experiences. And then when you think of like a square, like I was thinking in nature, like where would there be a square? Because at least in our like manufactured lives, the square, like the rectangle, obviously like are buildings and buildings and buildings, just like really simple shapes that are elongated. But I was thinking, okay, well, like really sheer cliffs, like the White Cliffs of Dover we have here. These are like really good examples of like rectangles or squares, and the color, of course, is like nothing like that red that he's talking about. And then this is like a Devil's Postpile near Mammoth, which is just like these hexagons. One, two, three, four, five. They're just like kind of formed next to each other. It's like strange mineral or strange type of like chemical like uh, construct, and it makes these like kind of flat looking shapes that, if you were to look at it from here, it looks like a long rectangle. And this is more of a hexagon. And then so I was walking around, I was starting to take pictures of things, and I was starting to think like, okay, well, what are some examples of shapes in nature that are triangles? Like, what are natural triangles? And I started to realize like they're pretty much everywhere. Like the first most obvious one that comes to mind is the peaks of mountains, and especially the peaks of mountains that are a little bit older. Or, I'm sorry, are pretty young. So like the Sierras are considered pretty young. Like the Denali Mountain Range is pretty young, and so those mountainous peaks haven't been eroded at all, and so they're like very very jagged. But then if we look at kind of like older mountain like ridges, I would assume the Appalachian Mountains would be a good example because I've only seen them once in person, but they are really smooth. They're considered mountains, but they look like just rolling hills. But this is across from the Sierras. This is the like White Mountain, like Inyo Mountain range. Here we go. We're looking from the like bristlecone pine forest area to the Sierras, and Sierras are fairly more jagged. And then here you have like a lot more rounded shapes when it comes to the Inyo Mountains. I don't know if they're older or if they just had like some more erosion. But here's an example of just I was thinking triangle initially, but here's an opposition to that, which is more rounded shape. And then I was looking more closely at like plants too, where like yeah we have these like circular and blue juniper berries, which is just happens to be kind of seems like a coincidence, but we have all these like triangular shapes inside the negative space and also just the regular like little branches of these of the juniper like leaves, as well as the pine needles, like these little triangular shapes inside here. Also the negative space that's created based on the like branches, more of these like triangular shapes like negative space right here that are created. You know, there's just like very little or like almost no square going on at all. And then of course more of these triangles. You can kind of argue like, okay, right here, this whole shape, and then up to here, then up to here is like a kind of rectangle. But I was just kind of thinking like we were just kind of thinking about this angle right here, and this angle like forms more of a triangle. Even though the tree itself, where did I put it? Oh yeah, the tree itself, like when it's cut and you're looking at it like directly in, the branches themselves are circular or round. And then here you have some more of the negative space. It's shaped like a triangle. And then in the dusk we have all these various like triangular shapes here. Here we go as well. And I thought that was like trying to kind of just whittle things down to a place where start to understand like the shapes of nature. I mean, this guy, he's like kind of presenting this kind of like this idea is like a fact. Like these are the most rudimentary shapes, and then these colors, they represent these, like, they like conjure up these like psychological like feelings. But here we are, like, I've gone out and just started to actually take my own like kind of mental notes about the way nature behaves, and immediately like disagreeing with him, that there's no like, I don't feel a yellow right here. I don't feel anything like the feeling of being active or that color at all. In fact, if I'm looking through the negative space of like a tree, then would be like the closest would be blue, you know. And then here we have, maybe before I go there, we should look at these right here. So I was just walking around and I was thinking, okay, cliffs, cliffs, cliffs. And then I just like looked down. I was like, oh, okay, the rocks are also like quite rectangular. Obviously not all rocks are. Over here in the Santa Monica Mountains, we have like these really strange, like rounded rocks that probably more like that way as a result of erosion. It's just kind of exposed like landscape. Um, and then you have some of these like flat shapes right here that are like more like a square rectangle. And then you have the rounded stuff. Again, I think it's just erosion, like this whole like landscape. Um, Again, just even contradicting the original concept that I promoted with like these like sharp mountaintops. So we have down below like what should be associated with this like passive in blue is more triangular, or actually I apologize, that this is more like rounded down here, but it's on the yellow side now, or like the red side. And then here's a rock that's kind of triangular, obviously, uh but it has like, yeah, so it's kind of another like um opposition to the like concepts I was just presenting. And then you have one that's got some square shapes to it and some like triangular shapes, and then more squares and rectangles and that kind of thing. And they're like red, they're filled with like iron, and they have, so maybe that is like the closest to like this shape over here, right? But still, like, I haven't I haven't like come across this. Now, I do understand that what he's trying to say is, okay, like, because this is most aggressive and like angles that like, and since according to him the color yellow is the most like active and aggressive, then these two shapes like should correlate with each other. Um, but should they? I don't know. It's a good question, Um, so now here's that same kind of like landscape, but with this like weird plant that's just like has all these strange like negative shapes to it that are, maybe some are kind of like squared, some are like triangular, all this kind of stuff. And what kind of psychological or primitive feeling does this kind of promote, like when you look at that? Um, Here's a cactus that might have like, if you were to really reduce it down, might have like a triangular shape to it, but it has like a rounded part to it. And then depending on the way that you look at pine cones, like you actually have one of the few things in nature that are like circular from above, but then like the individual aspects and parts of them are more kind of triangular. And then you look at it from the side, you have these like kind of half uh, circle shapes, and then you have these triangles too. And you're looking up at trees, you have all these like triangular shapes, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And then we get into like perspective, for instance, because it seems like the Bauhaus, especially if you see some of the posters. Here, I'll just show this real quick. I was gonna wait to show this a little bit, but here's a Kandinsky kind of creation from 1922. It's a flat painting, kind of like a graphic art idea, and it has no perspective, unlike his like earlier stuff, which is like full perspective. And then here's something later on. I forgot the date. I think it was in like the 1943. I think he made this one, so a little bit after this one right here. And it has absolutely no perspective to it, but has all these shapes that he's been promoting for quite a while. And you still get a sense of like human figures and that kind of stuff. But we'll go back up to this over here. And think about perspective. So since the Bauhaus seemed to be wanting to like share all these concepts from like a lack of perspective, in your two-dimensional paintings and drawings, when you do start to implement perspective, well, what shapes do you get? You get this weird like upside down triangle. If you just kind of like average this whole thing out, and then the background is blue. And then the inside is like a blend of yellow and blue, if you were to average it out as well. And then also in the sky, which is, the clouds are like super round and fluffy and, which should be considered blue, but when you have light shining through it, especially during sunset, these guys become red and yellow. The shapes definitely contradict that. So I was trying to think like what in nature like is yellow and is triangular, except for like the rare flower that you might come across that has like that a petal that's shaped in like a triangle. And what in nature is like, fundamentally like red and square, and that rock might be a good example, but it's not like we just come across that rock like every single day. The most common things that we experience are the sun, the moon, the sky, the clouds, the trees, And oh yeah, I should even mention too, like when we look at trees as well, like trees are like fairly aggressively shaped if you want to go with the Kandinsky way of looking at things, like but they're triangles if you want to like break them down. But then certain trees, they're kind of more rounded. Like if you were to back up far enough and you were to look at it, yeah, maybe you can draw like a big triangle from the top to the bottom, but that one's kind of rounded out. And then here we have a combination of like all these various shapes. We have like circle down on the ground and it's green, so it's not even blue. We have these clouds, and then we have like the triangles, and then where are the squares? Like I just don't see squares very often. Squares, I feel like today squares are like the most consistent thing in like modern architecture, but architecture is something that's only been around for what you know several thousand years. Um, and even then, it was like the pyramids way, way, way back, which were like triangular shaped. And so those are like not part of nature. Um, and then we have this. Maybe they were like influenced by nature in some degree, but here we have this fly's wings, which are triangular, and then it looks like a bee, but he's just a little fly that died on my dashboard. And then kind of like a weird kind of square butt, and like a circular head. Um, and then here we have like a really active evening. Like the evening is like orange and yellow and got some reds to it. And like, are these like triangles? No, there's like circles, you know? So, like, what was he thinking? Like, what was going on? Like, here we have a deep perspective that has like all these really like soft shapes going on. What was he thinking? Just like what can I extract from this experience? And learning art, like one of the first things you start to learn is that like there's these general shapes, and then we can reduce these shapes down to their like rudimentary kind of concepts. So those would be like the cone and the cylinder and the sphere and the cube and all this kind of stuff. And those are really useful for creating basic representations of like things that exist in real life, and then making it more complicated or detailed as you go further from that like base structure. But I feel like Kandinsky would argue that if you implement like a circle here and then like a triangle here to build these like shapes, then you're communicating some type of like psychological or like primitive like emotional like trying to like stoke this fire in the individuals. And then here we have a beautiful painting by Thomas Moran that has just like these deep blues in the shadow. So yeah, you could say that's more passive. And then you have like these reds. I don't think Thomas Moran ever like heard of Kandinsky. I could be totally wrong, but it's from a totally different field of thought. But yeah, reds, and then we have like these like nice kind of squared off like angles, like very few triangles going on. It's more like kind of squares, as they're rocks. Up close, more like cliffs. And then here with like Frederick Edwin Church, you have Cotopaxi, which is just like full on red. You know, um, Everything is just like saturated by this red, and just a little bit of yellow inside the sun. But like because it's behind this like smoke, this volcano, Um, it's producing this like red color, but I feel like this is like super passionate, super aggressive, and like when I see this, I just feel like, oh man, like the end of the world or something like that. And I don't feel the same like aggressive nature I feel from that Kandinsky's trying to promote through yellow. Um, so like where does that leave us? Well, because I've been thinking so much about like these like rudimentary concepts, like it has it has allowed me to think in simpler terms, right? Simpler like visual terms. And one thing that Kandinsky was trying to do is like create this vocabulary of like elements, right? So you have, as I described before, like the line, you have the point, which is the most like the simplest of them all. Then you have the plane, and then you have color and texture. And these are just like the vocabulary that is trying to be like communicated to the masses in this like universal form. And then they're like these this vocabulary is arranged in this grammar of like contrast. So you have like dark and light, you have like static versus dynamic, and then positive and negative. Um, and then if you just take those like kind of contrasts and you like simplify it down, just like he did, start to realize that like a composition can be really dramatic and interesting and like full of some really wild stuff, but at the same time, like you're just communicating in basic shapes and ideas, like as any artist might have, probably has known from the beginning of their like studies, that you can actually create some interesting stuff. And so I was just thinking in yellow, red, blue for a while, like somewhere in the back of my brain. I've got white in there. Kandinsky doesn't really talk about white or black so much, but he would probably group those in this like idea of contrasts. And I just started to use them as like accent colors wherever I wanted to get some type of like emotional feeling from it. Like I wanted the attention to be a little bit right here as a good contrast between the red and the white, and of course the parachute, the spinnaker um, of this ship Fortune is one of the most like grasping things that you could see. It develops like contrast between the whites, and then like the yellow kind of captures your attention, that maybe it's like kind of this warm kind of feeling that like the sunlight is like shining quite a bit. This is actually the first concept that I'd made, which was kind of like an idea kind of related to like a sunset, and I had played with different like contrasting colors, but still that like simple primary palette. Um, and then like the ship Fortune, like it has some aggressive shapes. In fact, we have a bit of a triangle here, and like up here we have. I guess I'll have to show you the animation. In the animation, you see like far more like kind of. And I guess I didn't really like include many like sharp points in that. I just like kind of use more like flat shapes. So really, like the few aggressive points in these like compositions I've made are the triangle of Fortune, and then like this little kind of point right here, and right down here as well. So it's like kind of a contrast that like kind of brings your eye together, like depending on these like different shapes. And even though the composition's like so simple. And then you have like my attention, I was kind of thinking about the idea of contrast as well. And here we have like these like curving lines. Everything in this composition was curving. In fact, the original one right here, like I was just going like full curve on everything. And then this one, after looking at some like really cool like videos on like sailing and that kind of stuff, I realized that lines are like taut almost all the time, unless it's something's like billowing or like losing wind. And so this straight line kind of contrasts the rest of it. Um, so like, what's the whole idea? Like, what is this like point? And like, I can't really, there's all these people like in the essay. This book actually did a really good job of like including some um, disagreements with this idea that like, red, yellow, blue, and these like correlated shapes have some type of like psychological like primitive meaning to them. And that was like really nice to see that they like weren't too stuffy about it, and they weren't taking themselves too seriously. But I think like if I was to try to like wrap this up in some type of like lesson or moral or whatever it is that like yeah, there are like all these like wonderful primitive shapes out in nature. Um, and to utilize them in like really, really simple ways, like basic ways, is absolutely possible. And like associating a certain color with it may like also bring about some type of, mood or like psychological interest. And it's really up to you to decide. Like if your landscape looks nothing like this, if you're in a landscape that's, oh gosh, like Iceland where you have all these like just black rock everywhere, it's like kind of porous and chunky, like what kind of mood or like shapes do you start to see in the negative space surrounding it, or the general shapes that it creates? Just food for thought, it's just something to kind of like chew on for a while and see like what can I pull out of this, even though it's a kind of like a strange, zany, like, proto modernist approach to art. Um, so yeah, so I'll basically leave it at that. I just wanted to take a moment to just do a little promotion here, like a little uh, shameless self promotion, and talk about how this world I'm building is available on Hick et Nunc. Um, and these are collectible NFTs, and they're done on. I chose to do. I was talking to Pete Morbacher a little bit about like getting into the NFT space, and a lot of people. He was really promoting this hen space because the cost to mint is like supposedly the electrical cost of minting on hen is less than the electrical cost to send a tweet. So, and they allow the creator to create up to 10,000 editions of it, and of each, like, minting. And I was thinking, like, okay, well, if I went with like the Ethereum platform, like Ethereum hasn't switched from proof of work to proof of stake at all, and it just costs like exorbitant fees, like anywhere from, I've heard, like $50 to like $500 to mint. And so you would expect the collector to have to pay at least that much and then like more on top of that. So the art that's being traded on that platform is typically like, fairly expensive, and it's one of ones. And that's like a really interesting approach to things, but I've always wanted to make art that was geared more towards like just the layman, like anybody can collect it. And Hen's going through this interesting transition right now where it's like they're doing a swap from their version 1 to their like version 2. They're like upgrading the system and making it more secure. And so it prompted me just to like just stop all the collecting that I was like providing. And there was a like an interesting event going on through Twitter that was like, um, okay, this weekend we're gonna do. It was like called the Hen Thousand. I think it was by this guy named John Marble, I believe, Twitter, and he's just like, okay, let's see how many editions you can sell of 10,000, and like whatever doesn't sell over like 40 hours, just like burn the rest. And so I participated, and I was just like, oh, like I don't know about this. This is kind of strange, and just kind of got like some weird feelings about it. And I had like posted these different like edition amounts, and then I went away on like vacation. I was just thinking like, okay, like what is really the most approachable way to do this? And so the advantage of Hen being that it's like so inexpensive, and I can make 10,000 editions, and then one Tez right now is somewhere floating around like $3 to $3.25, like USD, like fiat currency. I just figured like, okay, I might as well just offer these for 10,000 editions, 10,000 copies or 10,000 editions of this collectible like digital file, for one Tez, and then there's all these factors like Tez may go up, Tez may go down, the value of that. Um, my art may be more valuable in the future. My art may not be more valuable. There's like all these like variables. But I figure like if nothing else, instead of doing like a like uh trying to offer like one piece to like one collector for like $1,000, like why not like offer it to the public at this one Tez price, which is around $3+ 10,000 editions per animation, and then for the concept images 1,500 editions for those individuals who are like really excited about the concept art. So yeah, I'm just working on It's cool, like birdie. It's part of this like this next scene that I'm making. I don't want to talk too much about it, but of course, this guy I'm going to be animating. He's going to be like flapping around, and he's going to be getting into a little bit of a situation himself, in the context of Fortune, which I like had just showed you, this like ship. Um, and the ship and this like whole world is like this wonderful kind of inspiration, like cross between Sea of Thieves, which I've been playing a bunch of, and this game where like everything's like really slow paced and you're maneuvering like really slowly to try to like get right behind the enemy and then just like fill them with cannonballs. And Empire Strikes Back, which I just absolutely love, which I think I'll actually do a video on just some of my compositions of that space. Like there's some just absolutely amazing like compositions of that movie. I don't know what they were even thinking, you know. It's just like totally like next level. And yeah, and then like these weird like and I should say like these posters of this like the early 1900s of like flight and like train travel and some like the kind of interesting like graphic art like um advertising that was happening in the early 1900s, like beautiful like curved lines and like really simple colors and shapes. And it's been really fun so far, so excited to like flesh this out. And since this is like June or whatever, June, early June, and since they're changing over, it's currently at like uh, version 1. They're changing to version 2, but when it's all done, these will be available. So if you're watching this like 3 weeks later or 3 months later or a year later or whatever, like these will be available for trading on the platform. So I'll put the link of um, my hen terminal and the my address in the description of the video as well. So yeah, to conclude, I hope this gave you some food for thought. I was thinking about like trying to get more detailed and more like historic about the Bauhaus School of Design and like more intellectual, whatever that means. But there's just too much like too many little details to chew on, too many like strange like little considerations. But it in the end, it's just like an attempt to kind of peel away as many like layers of an onion, to get to its like core and like communicate this in like in a universal like format. So that's the best I can really do, and I hope you got some value out of it. And let me know like what you think. Like please comment in the comment section too. Like what are your thoughts about these like simple shapes? Like is there some type of like psychological or primitive like feeling you get from these like shapes and colors, and like what do they mean to you, and like are these feelings like possibly influenced by like some type of institutional kind of recommendation, or do you think they're actually like true and they exist deep down inside you? I don't know. I'd like to hear from you. And so yeah, thanks for joining me. I think in the future maybe the next one will be next time we talk about design, maybe we'll talk about the Serpentine line, or maybe we'll talk about like Star Wars Empire Strikes Back or something like that. And thanks for hanging out, and catch you later. Cheers.